Many years back, I had a stint when my to-do list seemed to pile up. I would start the day and seem to slog through everything I could, and at the end of the day, it wouldn't be clear if the list had gotten shorter or longer. And then, after a couple months of this, I think, there was this day in March, as I recall, when I got to work and I just cranked through this list. I mean, I was like Superwoman, crossing things off my list faster than Michael Phelps swims laps at the Olympics. And nothing that day seemed particularly insurmountable, and later that night, while talking to my mother, who always seems to know what's going on that I can't see, she pointed out that I was probably light sensitive, not seasonal associated depression sensitive, but slowed down by long nights and low light. Of course, it probably makes sense. My ancestors, at least some of them, were Scottish and Dutch, folks from those northern climes where slowing down in winter and conserving energy when food supplies were low and there wasn't much to be done anyway probably made a lot of evolutionary sense, right? It made me think, though, about the power of light. I mean, we know that it makes trees grow and flowers can help a crop flourish or can start a fire if put through a magnifying glass. It helps us to process vitamin D, but it can also do damage to our skin cells. But that it can change who we are in the world. And whether we're looking into it strong and sure daily or shielded from it by clouds and distance for months, that we are literally rigged to have, in some ways, our destiny or our well-being or our motivation and our health tied to the light in so many ways is astounding to consider. And as Carmen pointed out, light is tied to our literal ability to see, also our ability to navigate the world. And so it's tied metaphorically, of course, to our sense of knowing and wisdom, how we talk about that, enlightenment, the state of having light shed onto something or from within ourselves, enough that we can see it clearly, but not so much that we're blinded by it. So light is literally determinative and powerful for us, but it also has metaphorical significance. And the story of Hanukkah that we get is this woven fabric of both of those aspects of light. The story that we most often tell around this holiday is one of the second temple being recaptured after it had been taken over and desecrated by the Greeks, how it was recaptured, right? But no one could find the oil, the sanctified oil that burned always in the central tabernacle of the temple tended to by the priests, but which had been extinguished in the sacking. And in the story, someone somewhere finds this small amount that has survived, that was salvageable, enough for one day, maybe. But it burns for 8. That story captures a lot, though it was, in fact, apocryphal. A stand-in, you might say, for a more substantial and complicated history that isn't told quite so quickly, that's behind the holiday. A story which also is a story of victory against the odds. It's the story of the Maccabees, of course, which is a complicated story of repression and liberation, of authoritarian demands that a people compromise and rebellion against that compromise. is actually a story that feels particularly relevant right about now. So let's go there. The history that leads up to the rebellion of the Maccabees is a history of a conquered people. First, under Alexander and then under his generals, one and then another, as they conquered each other's territory, this group of Jews in Israel was on shifting political ground. The constant of their experience during this period, from the 4th century before the Common Era for about 125 years, was a strong Hellenistic cultural milieu. Greek culture pervaded the territories, as you might imagine, and its influence was due both to its attractive pull and an intentional pressure on conquered peoples to assimilate. The first king after Alexander did not place much pressure on the Jews to convert or to assimilate. He actually gave money to the Jews to help rebuild the temple and granted them the right to live and worship according to their laws. Judaism became a permissible state religion under this king. And any pressure to assimilate at this point was internal. The elite, the worldly in this world, the powerful, were Hellenistic, and local Jewish elite felt drawn to intermingle with these people who were, in fact, their peers. But Jewish law and Jewish custom made that intermingling nearly impossible. I mean, first there were the Jewish laws that prohibited intermarriage and the dietary laws that prevented social contact. And so among Jews in Jerusalem, a group that believed in aggressive assimilation grew. Meanwhile, among the poorer and less educated, largely the farmers of Judea, there was outrage at this assimilationist group of Jerusalem faithful. The two factions of the Jews came to blows under the rule of the next king, Antiochus IV. After much jockeying for position, things had come to a head when the king was away in battle. Antiochus had actually placed his own assimilationist priest at the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, one more accommodating to Greek traditions, and the former high priest at the Holy Temple and his followers took the king's absence in battle as a perfect opportunity to try and oust the upstart priest. Well, the king, he didn't take kindly to the act of rebellion and betrayal, and he sacked the temple as a form of punishment. Then, as more conservative Hasidim started harassing the Jews who had abandoned Jewish practices, Antiochus hit on another solution. Antiochus dreamed up this vision of Judaism that he thought was pure and universal, and that would unite these two factions. Rabbi Irving Greenberg says of this move, it was neither the first nor the last time in Jewish history that a universalist determined to straighten out the Jews and/or Judaism showed gross ignorance of the faith, condition, and integrity of the Jews. In reality, the fundamental problem was that Antiochus' supposedly universal solution looked pretty Greek. I mean, in this universal Judaism, the temple was stripped, and a statue of Zeus was erected. Offerings of pigs were made at the altar. And not just this one, but all around Judea, temple prostitutes were instated, a Greek tradition. Laws of purity systematically violated. And Antiochus IV sent his men out into the countryside to make sure in other places that these practices were also observed. Surprisingly, actually, all of this happens without too much incident until the soldiers meet with Mattathias, the priest of Modin, and the father of 5 sons. When the soldiers come and they ask Mattathias to make a sacrifice, he refuses. And the story has it that another man, a Jew, steps forward for reasons we don't know to make the sacrifice for Mattathias. Perhaps it was a kindness, but even if it were, it was not a welcome kindness. Mattathias kills the Jew who steps forward, and then the Greek soldiers too. And he and his sons head for the hills. There in the hills around Judea and Syria, this Mattathias and his people take up guerrilla warfare against the Syrian and the Hellenistic army. 1 year into the fighting, Mattathias dies, and his son, Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, takes over. Judas, a brilliant strategist, though outnumbered and outclassed in arms, he wins skirmish after skirmish, and he slowly wins converts from the formerly moderate Hellenistic Jews. 2 years after Judas Maccabeus takes over, his army of men, now called the Maccabees, defeat Antiochus's soldiers, and they take back Jerusalem and the temple. And the story of the morning often ends right there, though in reality the battle rages on. And ended or paused here, as we will also today. It's a story to make the weak heart strong. It is not just the story of David versus Goliath, but it has this added spiritual message, right? Not just that the underdog beats the bully, but the underdog risks everything in defense of his faith and the freedom to practice it. It's a story about this refusal to make compromises that cheapen and betray what you believe is right, and the power of conviction to sometimes bring victory from the jaws of defeat. It's a story also about how a small group's courage to face up to injustice against the odds can often have the power to lure and invite others, their hearts transformed by this courage, to enter into the good fight. It is then, though, a story full of bloodshed. It is then a good story to hear at a time when so much that is valued seems at risk. And people all around the globe are fighting against that loss or potential loss. In the intimate realm of our own city, in the country, in the world in which we reside, this has been a rough week, maybe a rough season. In addition to the protests in Hong Kong and the fight to preserve India's long and rich history of pluralism and the bloodshed in both of those fights, in addition to those far-away struggles made intimate by the media, this last Thursday, as many of you know who were there, a couple hundred of us, I think, gathered in UN Plaza, where we held banners and the names were read, and we honored the loss of officially 282 of our neighbors who died while living on the streets of this city. This city that can innovate solutions to problems we haven't even yet imagined, and create wealth at unrivaled speed, but hasn't put its heart and mind to solving the issue of how we help one another live with basic needs met. Half the time I ride BART, I don't know about the rest of you, or walk streets anywhere almost in this city, I feel like I am on the set of a dystopian novel. I mean, I almost look around for the crane with the camera set into it, but it's not a dystopian novel, right? This is our reality, a failure of imagination, of unequaled proportion. And this week, too, our president was the third to be impeached in, 243 years of our nation's life. And it's unclear, despite his consistent and constant flagrant violations of founding principles, of law, of ethics, of human decency, whether he will be found guilty, in part because of the Republican Party that stands unified in self-interested, sycophantic, stands like leaders with spines loose as rubber bands. This summer I was in London and I took a tour of Parliament because we have a friend of the family who's served in the House of Commons for decades. And he said the leaders there, they take 3 vows when they enter into their service. First is that their primary commitment is to the nation, second to the people who elected them, and third and last to their party. And when he said that, I felt my heart clench. I know that English members of Parliament don't fully honor those vows that they take, but that articulated standard made me yearn. I still think of leadership as a calling. Each and every place you and I do it. And especially in places, God knows, where we have the whole nation in our hands. And if it is such, if leadership is a calling, then my God, it is time for a national revival. And a good day to remember the Maccabees for sure. Because you and I imagine, are absolutely willing to throw open the windows and doors in our lives to powers beyond us that might come to our aid. As our poet Stephen Schneider wrote, we too wait some days for the Messiah to knock, however we understand that, wanting to know if he might join the party, if she might, if they might join the party. But we also can't wait for messiahs. And I imagine the Messiah is waiting for us. So we take heart from the leaders who have braved impossible odds when there was no Messiah in sight, people who had everything to lose when they fought, but also who would have lost far too much that was worth saving if they didn't stand up in opposition. In such wintry seasons of the Spirit as this, it's good to remember, too, in this moment, that sometimes we're told in the stories of old that a single night's oil, that one person's courage, can sometimes ignite resurrection. Tonight, Jewish households all around our country and our world will light the first candle. Some might already be doing so, depending on the time difference. First candle of the menorah, and as UU layperson Amanda Eudice Kessler writes, as we light it, quote, we rededicate ourselves to the miracle of light in the season of darkness. to the miracle of trust in a time of anxiety, to the miracle of hope in the time of despair, to the miracle of faith in a time of cynicism. We rededicate ourselves to the miracle of wholeness in a time of fracture, the miracle of courage in a time of fear, the miracle of resistance in a time of oppression, to the miracle of peace in a time of violence. And in a time of hatred, we rededicate ourselves to the miracle of love. So, Tikkun Olam, my friends, may we spread and regather the light. Amen.